I've always been fascinated by the segregation model of Schelling. Thomas Schelling did a simple model. He said, okay, let's take a chessboard. And on that chessboard, he put down pennies and nickels. And he put them in an arrangement just on the chessboard and came up with a rule to say someone is comfortable being around other, so let's say a penny was happy where it was if it had a certain amount of pennies around it, a certain percentage. And a nickel was happy where it was on the board if it had, again, a certain percentage. And so in the 60s, he writes inside, I think in Micro Motives and Macro Behaviors was the book where I first read about this experiment, where he had just flipped coins and ran through a simulation a couple times and started to develop this intuition and this idea that a small amount of preference for people like you had large-scale ramifications for the whole environment. That even though someone was not wanting their world to be set up in a certain way, their small preferences made that world happen. So you were starting to see large-scale segregation of the pennies and the nickels showing up in different spots on the chessboard, even though the pennies and nickels would have been perfectly fine with a completely integrated world that they were living in. And he was very fascinated by that experiment and what he was doing, but a computer lets you do it on an enormous scale and lets you take that and start to explore not just pennies and nickels, but what if we had 3 groups? And what if we had different ideas that you could plug into it? Maybe there's not just a preference for things like you, but you have a preference for things that are not like you. And the ways that you can then take that simple model that he had and start plugging in new ideas, plugging in new information for the behavior of an individual lets you just completely explore that space and come up with new ideas. What if they don't live on a grid, but they live in a hexagonal grid instead of a square grid? What if they don't really live in a grid, but they just live in areas? What if you actually take it to a real world city grid of Chicago and plug people in, simulated people, and just watch what happens in a real neighborhood? That experiment is really, really hard to do in your brain, and it's hard to do running through it by hand on a pen and paper, but it's completely feasible to do with a computer, just to plug in new numbers, plug in new environments, plug in new behaviors, and do an experiment in a few minutes that might have taken you a day or a couple days before the advent of a computer. So just a small example of how a computer can really assist in the science of complexity to let you explore things at a super high rate.